a timeline into how these changes took place, how would you describe that? Okay, 77 was a big event that we all know, and in the 90s, Sri Lanka was a fairly open economy in the sense, like you said, compared to others, right? Because all this is relative, and we had a globalization period that was happening in the 90s everywhere. So where did really things started changing?
So you're right about post 1977, post 1990, which is sort of the so-called second wave of reforms. And then I must say, the heightening conflict, the armed conflict, did suck up a lot of oxygen in the room in terms of both policy attention, but also resources, right? So financing of new initiatives that could have promoted exports, improved our borders, attention that policymakers and public officials had. So I think that was also in large part. But throughout that time, we were still broadly outward oriented. There weren't overt protectionist policies. We kept tinkering on the margins, and a lot of it was to do also with taxation, the need to collect revenue from this easy base of indirect taxes at the border. But something changed in the mid 2000s and latter part of 2000s, where the political establishment at the time and the party orientation, personalities in government had a very different economic ideology. And in a way, it was oxymoronic, because on one hand, we heard about these 5 hubs, some of which were, arguably outward oriented in nature or needed to be. But at the same time, we saw a trade policy that was slowly becoming more skewed to supporting domestic industry. Right. And I think that only accelerated with the end of the war and this heavy public infrastructure drive, debt-fueled public infrastructure drive, which created a whole bunch of incentives around focusing on the domestic economy. You had an emergence of new firms that were making a lot of money from focusing on the domestic non-tradable sector. So I think that then spiraled. It fed into both a narrative of growth, that this infrastructure-driven growth, non-tradable-driven growth is the future. It also fueled a feedback loop between, I think, the private sector and government, because the more money was being made there was more incentive for the private sector to lobby for further policy orientation towards that, which then the government kept delivering on. So I think that was a distinct shift point in time. And then we saw in 2015 some attempts to try and reverse that. And that's the period of time that I got also excited and decided to work in government. And we did manage to do some things, but I think both the entrenched interests as well as the extent of the reform that needed to be done, we just didn't get far enough. So I think we may have pushed back a little bit on that inward-oriented trend that we saw, but it certainly wasn't enough to really breach that barrier. And now I think another more recent turning point was with the onset of the pandemic, where even as other countries did introduce some trade barriers, some of them, of course, on the export side, export restrictions on PPE and so on, which Sri Lanka didn't do. But for preserving balance of payments and so on, some countries also did curb imports, but they also took it off.
Right.
And
this is in the recent crisis,
exactly,
COVID, etc.
2020.
Okay.
And what we saw with Sri Lanka was that these trade policy measures that were ostensibly taken to fight the crisis very quickly became de facto industrial policy.
Right.
And, one can almost forgive policymakers if it was a determined, well thought through attempt to go from those measures to de facto industrial policy, but it wasn't. Yeah. It just stumbled. Yeah. They just stumbled into it. So I think that was, in terms of time periods, I would say that was the last. And comparing to other countries that took smaller trade measures and then had a sunset on those after the initial crisis was over. Those have now become de facto in industrial policy. So you almost have a further reinforcement of that inward-looking trade policy.
Yeah. So I remember kind of how I think maybe both of us were kind of in our school days when that whole rhetoric changed to unplugging from the world and this plug galavim and all that sort of stuff. So that rhetoric change happened in I think about 2004 with a certain political change that, that accompanied it. So would you say that, one of the things that some of our friends who promote industrial policy says is like, look, this wasn't industrial policy. It was just, the needing of tax revenue and then just you erect a bunch of tariffs. And it wasn't a kind of well thought through industrial policy. So it was even inward looking policy done wrong. And then it kind of ended up in what you were talking about in kind of entrenched interests who now make supernormal profits. So would you say that in your experience in government, when you try to undo some of this stuff, can you talk to a little bit about how that was?
Yeah, so a couple of things. We have to look at, to be fair, by some parts of the business community, they have lost faith in the ability to of the country and the government to create a level playing field. And
right.
I know this word level playing field is used a lot, so I'll tell you what I mean by that. So I've interacted with businesses, including exporters, who do very well in international markets, but at the same time are some of the most ardent proponents of Sri Lanka becoming more protectionist. Okay. Some of them are doing so for very silly ideological reasons and baseless, but some also do it because they feel that there isn't a level playing field. And that speaks to Sri Lanka's lack of improvement and sophistication with border procedures or gaps in the regulatory regime for imports. And that's a real problem. So for example, when Sri Lanka moved to the NMRA Act, National Medicinal Regulatory Authority, Act, and that came from the Cosmetic Devices and Drugs Authority Act. It became NMRA. There was this big gaping hole for cosmetic products.
Right.
So the drafters, the public officials who came up with that change kind of forgot about that. So we saw a lot of manufacturers in that space of cosmetics and related products pushing back on any trade reform, any outward orientation, because they were angry about this one piece. And rightly so, because they saw poorly regulated products coming in, uneven playing field. So that narrow experience then informed their overall view, perception, attitude towards trade in general.
Right.
So the point I want to make there is on the first point, we didn't do enough to have that entire regulatory regime evolve over time, and there were too many of these gaps, too many feelings of that uneven playing field, government not being effective enough in those spaces. But of course, on the other, it really was this idea that if the policy regime is going to be skewed in favor of domestic industries, if we can go and lobby a minister and get those advantages, we can make it work. And capital was following, right? So you have even the financial sector very happy to lend to these businesses that were able to show supernormal profits because they basically had a easy canvas to work with. Right. There was very little risk of those businesses failing because you were operating under an explicit protection regime. So I think in part it was just that policy skewing which then fed all of those incentives. I guess one other thought, reflection I would have, I guess, looking back at my time in government, is that we didn't do, and I think to this day not many people have done, reminding folks with numbers, reminding folks that the export-oriented sector and the trade-oriented sector writ large has a premium. So even wage premiums, we're working with the World Bank to show that an employee in an export-oriented firm has a significant wage premium over a comparable employee in a non-export-oriented firm.
Yeah.
And those are kind of the data points that we should have been talking about to remind everyone that exports is good for the economy, trade is good for the economy. So yeah, I think that would be a reflection I have.
So all this has meant that Sri Lanka's export basket has kind of remained static for a long time. So I think a lot of policy circles, we talk about it on how do you diversify this export basket. So now that we are in the situation we are in, how do you kind of move forward? What are some of the tools that are available for policymakers to basically get out of this rut?
So before I get to what are some of those tools and initiatives, the first thing to set out is that at a headline level, you're absolutely right. There's been very little diversification. So if you just simply look, and I'd encourage everyone to use this very easy tool that the Harvard Center for International Development developed. It's called the Atlas of Economic Complexity, and you can easily map over a time period across countries how that export basket has changed. And you compare Sri Lanka's to, say, Thailand or Vietnam, over 20 years, the picture has dramatically changed.
Right.
From agricultural goods to light manufacturing to high value manufacturing in electronics and so on. In Sri Lanka, that picture has changed very little, certainly not as dramatic. But at the margin, there has been diversification.
Right.
So now, thinking about the kind of products that Sri Lanka exports, you have Sri Lankan exporters in automobile and electronics global supply chains, manufacturing for some of the biggest companies in the world. We have even within traditional sectors. So I think that's a cautionary note when you look at some of these maps. Even if you are in a traditional sector, say coconut or spices, but you're doing very high-end things.
Yeah.
For example, in spices, very high-value extracts for the nutraceuticals or pharmaceuticals or perfume industry, it still gets clubbed in your in that agriculture box. So I think within some of the traditional segments, at the margin, Sri Lankan companies have diversified. And even outside of those sectors, Sri Lanka companies have diversified going into electronic components, automobile components, and so on. But it's not the norm, right? It's somewhat of the exception. In terms of moving forward, drawing from what we see there, a big determinant has been FDI, export-oriented FDI, either greenfield or joint ventures. I think moving forward, the number one priority has to be, in order to see the kind of dramatic shift that we see with our competitors, bringing in export-oriented FDI to partner with Sri Lankan firms or greenfield who will take us into these new diversified product categories, into new global supply chains. And I think that's where, as much as the trade policy has been skewed inward, I think FDI policy has very much favored, again, domestic non-tradables, property development, real estate, and understanding that the incentives, and here I mean in a crude form, fiscal incentives, the kind of fiscal incentives that are looked at by, say, a market-seeking FDI, like a real estate property kind of project, versus an efficiency-seeking FDI, which is in exports, is quite different.
Right.
And our FDI promotion agencies and those in charge of that really haven't understood that, and you keep, flogging the same horse. So I would say the first priority is export-oriented FDI. Mm-hmm. The second is, and I don't have an answer on the how, is unlocking some of the, what I would call inefficient capital that is locked in with very competent Sri Lankan businesses who are focusing on the domestic market.
Right.
So some of the work that I'm doing now takes me to other countries in the region, and I see a lot of very competent, well-capitalized businesses in those countries having moved into export-oriented businesses with those surpluses that they generate.
Right.
In Sri Lanka, we see those, I wouldn't say all, but a lot of those high-end top businesses that have access to capital, that have good management, doing more and more internally, more and more domestic, non-tradable activity. And that goes back to the point about why would they do that? And the question is, why wouldn't they when the going is so great? So I think by changing that policy regime to be more outward-oriented, it's going to signal to the financial sector, to capital, where capital is, and to those businesses, where should I be investing that next extra rupee or extra dollar? Removing the highly attractive domestic non-tradable space, I think would shift them towards that. And I think it's a real shame that we have well-run businesses that could perform very well globally, locking their capital in this inward-looking, domestic, non-tradable kind of sectors.
Yeah.